Hello class, today we are looking into an essay by the philosopher Rebekah Cron. She wrote this essay in 2014 titled Is Cryonics an Ethical Means of Life Extension? And she graduated from the University of Exeter in England, and this is her dissertation. In the United States, we usually consider a dissertation something that you work on to get a doctorate. In this case, the dissertation was to get her bachelor's degree, which means that she was working on this as an undergrad student. And so, question is, what is cryonics? The cryonics has to do with the cryonic preservation of human beings in this case. And cryonic, the word, has to do with the scientific process of cooling things, the scientific study and process of cooling things at very low temperatures. And so this is technically understood as cryosuspension. And Cron focuses on the company Alcor Life Extension Foundation in Scottsdale, Arizona. And so you could opt to have your body cryonically suspended roughly for the price of $70,000 to $200,000. And it's probably more now since this was written in 2014. And the company Alcor, ALCOR, stands for an acronym meaning allopathic cryonic rescue. And so allopathy is a medical perspective to designate any treatment which improves the prognosis for the well-being of the patient. So in other words, Alcor is promising a possibility for life extension, or at least they're helping you with this idea that you could possibly be revived. And so a good part of the motivation behind cryonics rests on the idea or hope that we might be losing out on the possibility of life after death, instead of opting for the decision, say, to cremate or bury the body. And so we are then hoping for the possibility of life extension. And so we're hoping for, when we are becoming cryonically preserved, we are hoping for the possibility of life extension, and also hoping for the possibility of extending life, and also to be cured of whatever disease we originally died of. So that's an issue, right? Like, so say you die of cancer, then you become cryonically preserved. Then a technical problem there is that you are not only hoping to become revived at some future date with the possible technology that would revive you, but then you're also hoping that there will be a way to work on the cancer that you had as well. So hoping for a cure of cancer, I guess, would be the possibility that you're hoping for. So in other words, cryonics is a means, at least as it's presented by Alcor and people that believe in the process, it's a means of saving future lives is the idea. So ideally, the cryonic process should start within 2 to 15 minutes after the heart stops. So in other words, you need to have arrangements beforehand to start the process, because obviously that window is very slim. And so, of course, arrangements have to be coordinated with hospice, say if you're in hospice, and Alcor ahead of time to start the process right away. And so first step then is the body is placed in an ice bath, and then anesthetic is administered to protect the brain. And then blood is circulated out of the body and replaced with what is termed an antifreeze. And this antifreeze is a way that you can be preserved without damaging your body. And so this is to prevent freezing, given that cryonics technically is not freezing the body, although that's more or less how we think of it. And so then vital organs are simultaneously monitored while this is happening to prevent damage. And the body is submerged in liquid nitrogen starting at negative 193 degrees Fahrenheit. And so then the temperature decreases to a mean of negative 196 degrees. Oh, sorry, a negative 320 degrees Fahrenheit. So it takes a while for the body to actually get down to this temperature, and that takes about 2 weeks. And we should also note that the patient has the option of cryonically suspending just their head, or then they could cryonically suspend their entire body. And so it's something I have written here, $200,000 for the whole body and about $80,000 for your head alone. And some people are just opting to preserve the head, hoping that there will be technology in the future to do something with your head to revive you back to life somehow. And so most importantly, keep in mind that no one has been revived from cryonic suspension. And we do know that dogs and pigs have been revived in the past, but not human beings, which means that people who are cryonically suspended do so only with the hope that technology will improve their chances of a healthy reanimation. And as we pointed out, not to mention the hope for a cure of the disease that killed the person to begin with. Because that really is an immense technical hurdle to think of. So I mentioned cancer earlier, but say you have a terminal disease of some kind, you're hoping then that once you die of that terminal disease, that when you are revived, they have a way of dealing with whatever you died from as well. So you're also hoping for that possibility, which seems rather unlikely, but still there are people that have this hope. And so we'll add too that cryonics is not a means of immortality. And that's key there, because oftentimes when people are having this conversation about cryonics, they will often, including experts in the field, refer to the possibility of immortality as well. And I think that would be a little too optimistic, obviously, right? So because we have to imagine that even if you are reanimated, and then even if you are cured of the disease that killed you, you will still have to die again, right? That in other words, once your body's brought back to life, let's say that's possible, we're gonna have to say that then you still will technically have to die, right? Because there's no guarantee that this is so-called immortality, because that's a whole different issue there, and also obviously a bigger problem to solve. And so cryonics really is only a way in which we are hoping for the possibility of life extension with no promise of immortality, despite what even some of the experts are pointing out. And I think the problem there is really just the issue of overgeneralizing, so on and so forth. And then so now we are looking at the moral issues raised by cryonic suspension in terms of the ethical implications. And so here Cron is focused on how it is that we're looking at the, wrong booklet, we're looking at the biomedical ethics of Beauchamp and Childress. So, as Cron points out, an advocate for cryonic preservation is the American philosopher Charles Tandy, and Cron cites his work on cryonics, hibernation in light of bioethical principles of Beauchamp and Childress, and he also wrote on cryonics as a prospect of immortality. So there we could see that even the expert was making this push toward immortality when we're thinking more realistically that this seems to be somewhat of a high hope and probably impossibility. And so Tandy is an advocate for cryonic preservation. In other words, when we cremate our body or when we bury our bodies, we're giving up the possibility of life after death. And so Charles Tandy is trying to show us that a way in which we're considering the bioethical principles of Beauchamp and Childress in order to make his case. And Cron is examining these principles with Tandy in order to see and analyze the problems. And so Cron highlights the 4 principles of biomedical ethics developed by Beauchamp and Childress in their 1985 book, The Principles of Biomedical Ethics. And this is a way in which we're looking at standards in medical ethics as a means of setting moral standards for medical professionals, with the 4 principles to be recognition of autonomy, beneficence, and beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. So these 4 principles then are brought together by the cryonic enthusiast Charles Tandy with an application to cryonic suspension. And so the first principle is a principle of autonomy, or a principle of respect for autonomy. And so this basically entails for Tandy an obligation to keep the option of cryonic suspension open to people enough to choose it for themselves. And so the principle of autonomy for Beauchamp and Childress has to do with the relation to free will and autonomy of the patient to make informed decisions without outside coercion or interference from, obviously, healthcare professionals. And so this is the basis of what is known as informed consent, and that the patient is voluntarily in a position to choose or not to choose if medical procedures are what they want. And so in light of cryonics, this basically entails for Tandy an obligation to keep the option of cryonic suspension open to people enough to choose for themselves. And so by providing a legal environment that protects a patient's ability to make an informed choice about cryonics. And then with the principle of non-maleficence, that is that's the second principle of Beauchamp and Childress's biomedical ethics, and that has to do with this idea of the Hippocratic Oath. In other words, to do no harm. So medical professionals need not to harm the patient in order to help the patient. And so this is in relation to minimizing risks and avoiding carelessness or negligence of the patient undergoing healthcare procedures. And so here, Tandy is thinking that even though the effects of reanimation and cryonic suspension cannot be said to be worse or more harmful than simple burial or cremation of the body. So in other words, you're not hurting anyone by cryonically suspending the patient, and it can't be worse than simply cremating or burying the body. So Tandy thinks it's a good idea because it doesn't violate non-maleficence. Then with the principle of beneficence, this principle for Beauchamp and Childress is with regard to the idea that it's similar to non-maleficence in that healthcare professionals then have an obligation to provide benefit instead of avoiding harm in the best benefit for the best interest of the patients, right? So with that, Tandy is basically surmising that cryonics is then a beneficial alternative to burial or cremation, right? As far as he sees it, because then there's more of a promise of life after death, because when you cremate your body, then you're just simply giving up that option as far as Tandy sees it, or if you're burying the body, so on and so forth. Then in terms of justice, justice for Beauchamp and Childress is a way that we're thinking of an understanding of justice as synonymous with the application of fairness. And so in other words, how are we being fair to distribute the goodness of care equally, fairly, and with equity? And so in terms of justice, we should have equal and fair access to cryonic suspension for Tandy. And then so essentially for Tandy, doctors have a moral obligation to ensure cryonic suspension for patients. And with the overall position that Cron and this overall position of Tandy's, Cron doesn't necessarily agree with. So for example, with beneficence, Cron suggests that the possibility of alienation from friends and family is a very real and practical risk that does not necessarily justify full reliance on the principle of beneficence, for example. And then Tandy also suggests that cryonics should be made freely and available to everyone who wants it, which in terms of expense does not completely justify cryonics as a whole. And so this is obviously a problem for everyone, right? So the sheer expense is enough to call this into question as a universally free option, because that was something that Tandy was suggesting, that it should be made universally free. And so in terms of justice, it stands to reason that money could be allocated, as far as Cron is concerned, for those who are living and hence need it more. And in that case, that could either be the family or taking the money that someone would be using to cryonically preserve themselves and donating it to charities that help people that are living. And then by those who are resting a gamble on revival. And so also from a utilitarian vantage, the happiness of most is not sufficiently met for the living, who likely need the resources more than those who are already dead. And there, like I pointed out, you could be thinking of the family that's being left out of these resources, or likewise people who could benefit from the charity. And so even if on the surface it sounds nice to suggest that people should be able to freely choose to be cryonically suspended, not all can afford the procedure, beyond suggesting it should be free to all. So to afford the $200,000 plus procedure could only be made to a select few, or the rich, which is exclusionary, and never mind either the gamble we get to think of in terms of the future only for the few or the people that could afford it. And so cryonicists like Tandy argue that one could see cryonics as a life insurance policy, for example, to be paid over a lifetime in terms of monthly installments, so on and so forth. And so there's also the possibility of alienation from friends and family, which is an issue that Cron elaborates on later. And never mind the fact of the expense, that it can't be afforded by the poor. and also the egoistic, exclusionistic tendencies are vividly and ethically questionable for us, obviously for Cron. And so another ethically problematic question rests on the case, for example, of the theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking, who had ALS, and he could also be a candidate for cryonics. Yet, what about the problem of convicted criminals and the mentally insane, so on and so forth? And so Cron proposes this idea that are we going to have committees of people such as medical experts and philosophers and ethicists who could be responsible to decide who gets cryonically preserved, which is then obviously a problem. And so with this, we are then magnifying the problems of the issue of Beauchamp and Childress's application to cryonics. Okay, and then with her subchapter number 3, we have ownership of bodies as anatomical gifts of research. And so with this topic, this also ties into Beauchamp and Childress's principle of biomedical ethics having to do with a respect for autonomy. So all you're really thinking of there is that Cron was also using Beauchamp and Childress's principles to examine how it is that we're ethically justifying or not calling into question problems of cryonics. And one problem of cryonics is this respect for autonomy, given that due to state laws in Arizona, in Scottsdale, Arizona, Alcor requires that people who sign up for cryonic hibernation or cryonic suspension must donate their bodies as anatomical gifts of research. So this is tied to the problem that Alcor will return ownership of your body upon reanimation. And so several moral and ethical problems arise with regard to problems, as Cron highlights. So suppose your family, you and your family all get cryonically preserved at Alcor with the hope of reanimating together. And then say in 1,000 years, technology has advanced to reanimate, and there are technology failures that only enable, say, you to revive, okay? And the rest of your family then cannot be revived. But you're told by the doctors that yours is such a special case that you need to be kept alive, possibly against your will, due to the extreme and highly unusual case presented by your reanimation. And so this is obviously a problem. And so there's another frightful possibility that Alcor's good ethics shift hundreds of years into the future, right? Whereby you are revived as a medical anomaly and you're maybe then treated as a medical slave open to experimentation and other violations of autonomy. So obviously that's a hypothetical, but these are things that could be a very real possibility that we're not aware of. And then so Cron moves to cryonics having to do with suicide and euthanasia. And so if euthanasia is considered a quote unquote good death, it could present ethical problems in terms of suicide, whereby a patient could elect to die before such illnesses as dementia, terminal cancer, etc., take hold, along with other genetic predispositions, say, of cancer, etc. And then so euthanasia then becomes a type of insurance, provided that the reanimation goes hand in hand with a possible cure for such ailments that you are genetically predisposed to. And so such a possibility is still no guarantee. And also, given that preservation needs to be timely within minutes, there's also the very real possibility of killing the patient before the patient actually dies on their own. And so, in other words, you could see that people might be too hasty to turn to cryonics as a form of euthanasia before they even get a disease that they're genetically predisposed to die of, and Cron is seeing this as an obvious problem. Then she also is focusing on other problems having to do with alienation from friends and family. And so this presents other ethical anomalies. So for example, a patient might want to conceal his cryonic preservation plans from his family due to the egoistic message that the cryonic preservation is a way that he is being selfish in terms of looking to the future. In other words, the person who's doing this is sending the message, I wish to live I wish to live and spend time in the future on the gamble that I'll live into the future without my family. And this idea of the grass looking greener on the other side of cryonic hibernation is possibly a problem for the person's family, because they're feeling like, well, are you then suggesting that you could live a better life without us at some point in the future? And that's obviously an ethical issue. Then Cron also points out the issue of alienation from society and the problems of identity in cryonic revival. So for Cron and for us, alienation from society is a very real possibility. So consider the fact that people that are living now who are in their 80s and 90s already experience tech alienation. Never mind that the cryonically suspended person or patient might not be revived for hundreds of years from now. And imagine the alienating disconnect to be reanimated sometime in the future as far as so-called tech alienation. So the problems there. And so never mind the limitations and condition of your body upon reanimation. And so again, there's no guarantee that you'll be in tip-top health once revived, or that, as mentioned earlier, there'll be a cure. You're hoping that there'll be a cure for whatever ailment or disease that took your life to begin with. So I'm gonna stop it here around 28 something minutes and resume with her discussion on the issue of Pascal's wager in connection to cryonics. So I'll see you on the other side. Thank you, thank you.